Hey guys. Tonight we travel back to a world of velvet thrones, incense-thick air, and men in pointy hats who wielded more power than kings and made just as many enemies. But don't get too comfortable. You're about to witness a courtroom spectacle so grotesque, so surreal, that if you didn't know it actually happened, you'd assume it was the fever dream of a bored medieval playwright with a flair for horror. Let's just say, the defendant is already dead. Like, decomposing dead. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always love seeing how far we stretch across time zones. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a shadowy Roman basilica in the year 897. It's late winter, and the marble floors are slick with condensation. The air smells like damp stone and bad decisions. A hush falls across the chamber as guards enter, lugging something, or rather, someone between them. The corpse of Pope Formosus, dressed in full papal regalia, has been dug up, propped onto a throne, and is now literally on trial. That's right. Welcome to the Cadaver Synod. You can't help but stare. His shriveled fingers, curled like old parchment, the tattered papal robes, moth-eaten and speckled with rot. A deacon stands nearby, designated to answer questions on behalf of the deceased. It's essentially a medieval ventriloquist act, minus the comedy and plus the stench. Pope Stephen VI, the man presiding over this farce, paces in front of the corpse like a prosecutor on a mission. He levels accusations of perjury, of seizing the papacy illegally, of just generally being a spiritual eyesore. But really, this is personal. Historians still argue whether Stephen was settling a grudge or trying to undo his predecessor's appointments. But either way, it's less about justice and more about drama. The audience watches in silence, equal parts fascinated and horrified. It's not every day your bishop shows up for court after already being buried. And you thought reality television was shameless. You shift uncomfortably. The basilica is cold, and the spectacle is colder. Someone coughs. Another person whispers a prayer, maybe out of piety, maybe out of sheer awkwardness. Eventually, the trial ends in a guilty verdict. Shocker. Formosus is stripped of his papal vestments. 3 fingers, used for blessings, are hacked off, and his body is tossed unceremoniously into the Tiber River. But because this is medieval history, and it never stops escalating, the body washes up on shore. And some say it starts performing miracles. Cue the crowds, the candles, and the poorly coordinated street shrines, and Pope Stephen. Let's just say karma doesn't skip leg day. Public backlash is swift and brutal. Within a year, he's arrested, imprisoned, and ironically strangled to death in the same dungeon where he probably rehearsed his corpse monologue. The Catholic Church will eventually declare the Cadaver Synod null and void. Future popes will try to bury the scandal figuratively this time, but the smell lingers. You're left wondering if there's ever truly a dignified way to handle internal HR conflicts when one party is literally decomposing. You walk away from the basilica in a daze, cloak pulled tight against the wind, Rome is quiet. Like it's embarrassed. Or maybe it's just digesting what it's witnessed. A trial so bizarre that it sets the tone for centuries of papal drama to come. As you wander past the Forum ruins, your feet crunch over old gravel and newer regrets. You think about how the church, for all its hymns and halos, was still run by humans flawed, shaming, panicked humans with grudges deeper than the catacombs, a man nearby hawks, holy relics, bone shards, feathered hats, scraps of robe. You try not to ask where they came from. And even though you didn't expect your night to begin with a zombie pope on trial, you can't help but feel you've only dipped a toe into the weirdness ahead. Trust me, it gets stranger. You don't get far before you're drawn into another Vatican-era train wreck. This time wrapped in perfume, ambition, and the kind of plotting that would make a soap opera writer sweat. You're still in Rome. But it's a few decades later now. The papal throne hasn't exactly been wiped clean of drama. In fact, it's more like someone took a sponge, soaked in olive oil, and just smeared the mess around. This time, the scandal revolves around Pope John XII. Picture this, a young man, barely out of his teenage years, suddenly becomes the most powerful religious figure in Christendom. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. You wake up one morning in the Lateran Palace to the sounds of shouting, giggling, and something that suspiciously sounds like furniture breaking. It's not a riot, just another Tuesday in Pope John's quarters. The man's bedroom is a rotating door of courtesans, nobles, and the occasional bribed bishop. It's less of a holy sanctuary and more of a medieval frat house with incense and blood oaths. John is known for throwing wild feasts, gambling in full view of his cardinals, and no joke consecrating a teenage boy as bishop because the kid gave him a nice hunting falcon. It's a vibe, a very unorthodox one. You walk through the corridors and notice the place smells more like spiced wine than sanctity. Rumors swirl like incense smoke. John once turned the papal palace into a brothel. He committed simony so brazenly, it could have been printed on his stationery. And he blessed weapons for his favorite warlord friends. Historians still argue whether the accounts of his decadence were exaggerated by political enemies. But the sheer volume of accusations doesn't exactly paint a halo around his head. One day, it disappears. Just gone. Whispers fly, was he assassinated? Poisoned by a jealous husband? Struck by lightning while mid-sin? Nope. He died in bed. Reportedly during a rendezvous with a married woman. Some say he was killed by the woman's outraged husband. Others say by a stroke or seizure. But whatever happened, it was not saintly. And yet, somehow, this wasn't the end of scandal. It was just a palate cleanser, because behind every wild pope is a crowd of even wilder advisors, lovers, and rivals. And one of John's mistresses, here's where it gets spicy, allegedly had connections to another noble family that wanted a say in who got to wear the papal tiara next. Politics in Rome aren't always decided with votes. After all, sometimes they're settled with poisoned figs. You linger a moment in the palace garden, which should be a place of reflection, but instead hosts whispered conversations and occasional duels. You hear two cardinals argue over bribes in the rose hedge. Another walks past you, counting coins, not rosary beads, and somewhere in the distance, bells ring, not for mass, but for another dead cardinal. Natural causes. Debatable. There's a saying going around. You know it's a holy day when no one gets stabbed before breakfast. Dark? Yes. But accurate. Back in the city streets, Roman citizens joke about the church with an eye roll and a shrug. They still light candles, still cross themselves before dinner, but they've also started leaving room in their prayers for self-protection. Just in case heaven's too busy with palace gossip to notice, you sit on the edge of a fountain, watching pilgrims walk by in wide-eyed awe. They don't know the full story. They still believe in the magic, the relics, the saints, the golden glow of papal authority. And you get it. It's easier to believe in the divine when you don't peek behind the curtain. But you did peek. And now? You know that sometimes the men behind the robes are just men flawed, feverish, and, in John's case, tragically fond of dice games and ill-advised bedroom adventures. A dove lands nearby, cooing gently. You try to interpret it as a symbol of peace, but it pecks at a discarded fig and waddles off without fanfare. Divine signs aren't what they used to be. Still, you take a deep breath. The sun's setting, and the shadows stretch long across the cobbled plaza. You hear someone mutter that a new pope's been named already, probably another teenager with a sword collection and a taste for chaos, and you're only on your second scandal. You don't even bother sleeping, after witnessing one pope drag a corpse to court and another turn the papal palace into a no-holds-barred medieval bachelor pad. Rest feels like a lost cause. So you wander. The moon hangs low over Rome, softening its jagged skyline, casting everything in a silvery hush until, of course, you arrive at the Vatican courtyard and hear what sounds suspiciously like a lute, laughter, and someone falling into a decorative fountain. You follow the chaos inside and realize you've arrived at yet another turning point in church history, the reign of Pope Benedict IX. Yes, the ninth, but more importantly, the boy pope. He's not just young, he's practically still in puberty. Sources claim he was appointed around the age of 12. Give or take a year depending on the gossip channel you trust. You step into the palace and immediately notice the vibe is more rich kid with no curfew than humble servant of God. He's lounging on a velvet divan, snacking on grapes, while two greyhounds wrestle on the floor and a bored-looking cardinal attempts to explain the concept of canon law over the din of a jug band in the next room. A pope at 12 is already pushing the envelope. But Benedict IX doesn't stop there. He allegedly serves not one, not two, but 3 separate papal terms, being ousted, reinstated, and voluntarily stepping down in exchange for literal bags of money. Yes, this pope sold the papacy like it was a timeshare in the Alps. Historians still argue whether the details of his antics were blown out of proportion by later chroniclers who had a theological axe to grind. But what's undeniable is that his reigns were marked by bizarre behavior, open bribery, and enough drama to put a Renaissance court to shame before the Renaissance even got going. At one point, you overhear a cardinal whisper, "We're not even sure he believes in transubstantiation. He thinks it's just a fancy word for breakfast." You're not sure if it's a joke. But no one's laughing. One night, a formal banquet becomes a full-blown masquerade ball. Benedict arrives dressed as a Roman emperor, complete with a fake laurel crown and a tunic 2 sizes too long. He toasts to Jupiter, perhaps as a joke, perhaps not, and proceeds to challenge 3 bishops to a wrestling match. One accepts and instantly regrets it. The faithful outside the palace are confused. Some think the Pope is divinely inspired. Youthful exuberance, being mistaken for saintly energy. Others write panicked letters to distant relatives, begging for prayer circles and stronger wine. Eventually, Benedict IX's power slips. He's ousted. Flees. Returns. Is ousted again. And then, in a move worthy of a tired soap opera exit, sells the papacy to his godfather. That's right. He literally hands over the spiritual leadership of Western Christianity in exchange for coin. Who even does that? You, standing in the aftermath, find yourself in an abandoned hall filled with overturned goblets, y fin un sens trait, and a deep sense of ecclesiastical déjà vu. The velvet curtains still flutter from last night's mischief, and a forgotten mitre lies crooked on the marble steps. Was Benedict a villain? A victim? Or just a teenager in over his head? You lean toward the third. Historians aren't sure either. Some blame the powerful families who installed him. Others point fingers at a corrupt system that allowed literal children to wield divine power like it was a novelty toy. You step outside and breathe in the cold air. Rome is quiet again. But only for now, because the vacancy he leaves behind doesn't calm things, it ignites them. A merchant walks past you, hawking painted wooden plaques of saintly faces. Ironically, none of them resemble Benedict IX. You're not surprised. Somewhere, a choir begins to sing, as if nothing's wrong, but the notes feel hollow, drifting through a city where holiness and hilarity seem to share a very thin wall. And you, still blinking in disbelief, realize you've just witnessed the ecclesiastical equivalent of handing the nuclear codes to a middle schooler. And this was only the warm-up for the chaos still to come. You wander into a nearby chapel, half expecting peace, maybe a nap under a fresco or two, but instead, you find a ledger. Not just any ledger. It's thick, bound in flaking leather, and filled with page after page of neatly inked names and numbers, prices. You realize, payments, services rendered. And what are they selling? Exactly, heaven. They're selling heaven. You've entered the age of indulgences, where salvation is, essentially, for sale. All roads still lead to Rome. But now those roads are toll roads, and the gates of paradise creak open a little wider if your purse happens to jingle louder than your neighbor's. A cardinal glides past you, hands clasped piously, while his velvet robe swishes over the mosaic floor. You swear you see a gold coin fall from his sleeve. He doesn't stop to pick it up. At first, indulgences seem like a practical idea, penance paid not through acts of charity or hours in the confessional, but via a tidy donation to the church. Build a basilica. Shave off a few years in purgatory. Fund a stained glass window. Erase some mortal sins. It's heavenly finance. And it catches on fast. Pope Leo X, a Medici with tastes far more luxurious than humble fish and loaves, takes this to a whole new level. Under his watch, indulgences practically become a retail campaign. Traveling friars preach fiery sermons in marketplaces, declaring, As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Catchy, terrifying. You stand in a plaza and watch peasants line up to drop their hard-earned coins into collection boxes, hoping to shave centuries off grandma's ghostly weight. Meanwhile, a monk in the background quietly scoffs, scribbling notes with increasing fury. That's Martin Luther. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Historians still argue whether the sale of indulgences was born from sincere religious logic or shameless greed masked by incense. Probably both. But the effect is undeniable. It turns the church into something eerily close to a divine marketplace. Back in the Vatican, the mood is jubilant. Coin pours in from across Europe, funding grand renovations, paying off debts, and helping build that small, slightly famous dome known as St. Peter's Basilica. You walk through the construction site, stone dust in your nose, hammer strikes echoing like thunder, and try to ignore the irony that the foundation of this holy place was funded, at least in part, by the fear of burning eternally. Quirkier still. Indulgences aren't just for the dead or dying anymore. You can pay now to sin later. That's right. You can prepay your way into forgiveness, like it's a medieval version of a gym membership you never planned to use. And if you're rich enough, well, there's a menu. Theft 1, indulgence. Adultery 2, murder. That'll cost extra, but still possible. Sin has a sliding scale, and if you've got the gold, you've got options. One man, flushed from a recent confession and a surprisingly enthusiastic night of gambling, boasts that he's paid for his sins 3 years in advance. You're not sure that's how divine justice works, but no one stops him. By nightfall, you're back at the chapel, watching a bishop count coins by candlelight. The air smells like wax and warm silver. A choir hums softly in the distance. Ironically, they're singing about grace. It's hard not to feel a little grim. You came expecting scandal, but this is something different. This is quiet, methodical, systemic, not a drunken pope or a haunted courtroom, but a bureaucracy of absolution, humming along efficiently. You leave the ledger where you found it, pages still fluttering faintly in the breeze from a nearby window, and as you step back into the night, you wonder how long it'll take before someone, somewhere, decides to call this out. Spoiler, not long. The next morning, you wake up to church bells, birdsong, and the sound of someone shouting in Latin about someone else's children. At first, you assume it's a parish dispute, some farmer arguing with a priest over tithes. But no, turns out, it's a nobleman yelling because the Pope just claimed his mistress and raised a brood of half-holy bastards. Yes, we've reached the papacy of Pope Alexander VI, otherwise known as Rodrigo Borgia, a name that practically hisses when spoken, like a snake slithering down a marble altar. He doesn't just break his vows of celibacy, he burns them for kindling and lights the Vatican with the flames. You follow the scent of roses and scandal through the Vatican gardens and come upon a strange domestic scene. Children, plural, play among the hedges, guarded by Vatican guards and nannies dressed like minor saints. These aren't visiting aristocrats or young choir boys. These are the Pope's kids, his actual, biological children. Historians estimate he had at least 7, but some whisper the real number is higher. You watch one of them, Cesare. Maybe. Or Juan dual fencing, a dummy made of hay and borrowed arrogance. They're not just offspring, they're chess pieces in a game the Pope is playing with the entire Italian peninsula. Borgia doesn't try to hide them. Either. He dotes on them, gives them titles, lands, and more than one fast track into the ranks of the clergy. Nepotism, in his case, isn't a quiet favor, it's a lifestyle. You sit in a pew and listen as a bishop jokes. At this rate, we'll have a cardinal in diapers by Christmas. Lucrezia, the Pope's daughter, walks by in a procession later that afternoon, draped in gold, chin held high. She is a vision of nobility and rumor. Whispers about her swirl like incense, incest, poisoning, secret lovers. Whether any of it's true or just enemies running their mouths, no one knows. Historians still argue whether Lucrezia was a pawn in her father's game or a master manipulator in her own right. Back in the papal apartments, things aren't exactly monkish. Painted ceilings, imported silks, and bowls of sugared almonds sit beneath portraits that somehow make everyone look smug. Rodrigo throws lavish banquets where politics are discussed between courses of roast peacock and veiled threats. And then there's the matter of the poison. Allegedly, the Borgia family made frequent use of a special poison known as cantarella, rumored to be slipped into wine or sprinkled on food with all the subtlety of a choir hymn. Again, no proof. Just a lot of mysteriously short political careers and funerals with excellent catering. One evening, you're invited well. Okay. You sneak into a papal banquet. The walls flicker with torchlight, and the tables groan under the weight of cured meats, fine cheeses, and more wine than seems advisable for a holy gathering. Rodrigo sits at the head of the table, smiling like a man who knows exactly how long you'll live. A minor noble to your left begins sweating profusely after dessert. You decide you're not that hungry after all. Borgia's reign isn't just scandalous, it's strategic. He uses the papacy to elevate his family, to settle scores, to build dynasties. He's not shepherding souls. He's building an empire with incense and intrigue. Yet people still gather to kiss his ring. Pilgrims travel hundreds of miles to catch a glimpse of him blessing infants, sometimes with the same hand that allegedly signed execution orders hours earlier. The line between saint and sinner blurs so hard, it might as well be a watercolor. You sit beneath a statue of Saint Peter and try to reconcile the image of a church meant to represent divine grace with the reality of this gilded, grimy papal soap opera. A dove lands above the statue and poops on the pontifical hat. You take that as cosmic commentary. As night falls, you hear footsteps echo down the corridors of the apostolic palace. 2 guard pass, whispering about a new alliance, a sudden death, and whether someone remembered to taste the wine first. You're no longer surprised. Rodrigo Borgia will eventually die, probably not from poison. Ironically, but his legacy will linger. Cesare will continue his father's machinations with brutal efficiency. Lucrezia will become a duchess, a patron, perhaps even a victim, depending on which source you believe, and the church. It will keep marching forward, one holy scandal at a time. You leave the marble corridors of the Borgia Palace behind, thinking maybe things will settle down. Surely there must be a period in church history where the papacy becomes less HBO, but instead of calm. If you walk straight into what later historians, using the most diplomatic academic term possible, call the pornocracy. Yes, that's the actual word. And no, it's not a typo. You pause outside a basilica, trying to understand how a church built on apostles and martyrs found itself tangled in this particular mess. The 10th century is in full swing, and Rome is less the seat of divine power and more a bizarre soap opera run by a handful of ambitious noblewomen and their preferred popes. Step aside. Cardinals, the real rulers here, wear velvet gowns and know how to weaponize a glance. At the center of it all is Theodora and her daughter Marozia, members of the powerful Tusculani family. You see Marozia ride past in a gilded carriage, flanked by guards, waving like royalty. She's not Pope, obviously, but she might as well be. She's rumored to be the lover of Pope Sergius III, who, brace yourself, is also said to have ordered the murder of an earlier pope just to clear the papal parking spot. Again, historians still argue how much is fact versus slander. But let's just say the body count during this era suggests Rome wasn't exactly run on peace and forgiveness. You slip into a cathedral and eavesdrop as two bishops debate whether a recent papal decree was written by the Pope or dictated from Marozia's boudoir. One of them shrugs and says, "Whoever wears the slippers doesn't always wear the crown." Eventually, Marozia arranges for her own son to become Pope. That's Pope John XI, to be precise. Imagine being both a spiritual leader and the teenage son of the woman who just orchestrated your career. Oedipal doesn't even begin to cover it. As you stroll down the Tiber River, you pass whispering monks who mutter that Marozia's next move might involve putting her grandson on the throne too. It's like a medieval version of Succession, except with more incense and far fewer HR departments. Inside the Lateran Palace, the tension is thick. There are factions everywhere, some loyal to the Tusculani women, others to rival noble houses, and a few idealistic clerics still praying for something vaguely resembling divine guidance. Good luck with that. The worst part, the popes during this time are barely remembered for their theology. Their reigns are short, often violent, and dictated more by bedroom politics than biblical scholarship. One pope lasts 20 days before being murdered. Another is smothered in his sleep. One even resigns voluntarily, though you suspect it was more jump or be thrown. You find a ledger listing papal names and dates. It reads like a grocery list, with a very aggressive expiration policy. The 10th century saw over 20 different popes, some ruling for weeks, others for hours, and in between rumors of bribery, seduction, and enough secret deals to make Machiavelli blush. One strange little footnote you stumble across during this era. A pope's mistress was sometimes referred to behind his back, of course as the papal consort, a title that makes you simultaneously laugh and cry. These women, though dismissed by official church accounts, wielded real power. They weren't just gossip footnotes. They were brokers of bishops, dealers in doctrine. Back at the basilica, a statue of Saint Ape-Lank. Peter overlooks it all. His marble face seems less peaceful tonight, more disapproving. Or maybe that's just the shadows. You find yourself wondering how this same church, built on the bones of martyrs and hermits, is now caught in a power struggle that resembles a royal court during its midlife crisis. And yet, the system holds. Just barely. Pilgrims still arrive. Masses are still sung. And people still believe. Somehow, Theodora and Marozia will eventually fall from power overthrown. Imprisoned. Betrayed. But the damage they did to the reputation of the papacy that lingers, like candle smoke on velvet, you sit by the Tiber for a moment longer, wondering if any pope from this era actually wanted the job, or if they were all just pawns in someone else's scandalous story. Either way, you're starting to realize that history remembers popes less for their prayers and more for the chaos they left behind. You head east through the morning mist, looking for some spiritual clarity, maybe even a pope with a quiet soul and a half-decent prayer life. But instead, you stumble across one of the strangest ironies in all of church history, a pope who, for all practical purposes, might not have even been Catholic. You hear his name whispered with hesitation, Pope Anastasius II. On the surface, his papacy seems mild compared to the corpse trials and palace orgies you've just walked through. No wine-fueled duels. No sons with suspicious titles. No mistresses disguised as choir instructors. But dig a little deeper, and you hit theological quicksand. It's the late 5th century, and the church is in chaos over a divisive issue called the Acacian Schism. The eastern and western branches of Christianity are at each other's throats figuratively, for now, over whether they can reconcile with the Monophysites, a group that believes Christ had only one divine nature rather than both a divine and human one. Anastasius II, who just wants everyone to get along, is like that teacher who tries to stop a playground brawl by offering juice boxes and compromise. He sends envoys to Constantinople. He speaks kindly of a heretic. He tries to broker peace with people Rome has already excommunicated. Rookie move. You sit in the back pew of a basilica and listen to the murmurs. One bishop mutters, "He's shaking hands with the enemy." Another hisses, "He's selling out the Council of Chalcedon." Someone near you just shrugs and says, "Honestly, I think he means well." But in medieval church politics, meaning well is dangerous. When word spreads that Pope Anastasius has allowed heretical bishops back into communion, all theological hell breaks loose. Letters fly. Rumors spiral. And whispers begin to swirl that the Pope himself has become a heretic. Historians still argue whether Anastasius II truly sympathized with the Monophysites or if he was simply trying to avoid another East-West fracture. Either way, his efforts backfire spectacularly. He dies suddenly natural causes, for once, and immediately becomes the subject of both furious debate and prophetic warning. Fast forward a few decades, and Dante Alighieri, in The Divine Comedy, decides to cement Anastasius's legacy by placing him in hell. Not just any part of hell, either the real deep part, reserved for heretics. Dante might have gotten his facts confused. He possibly mixed him up with another Anastasius, but the damage is done. Once you're assigned a literary damnation, there's no coming back from that. Back in your own timeline, you stand in front of a half-crumbling mosaic of Anastasius II. He's depicted with a gold halo and solemn eyes, offering a blessing with 2 fingers raised. Nothing about him screams rebel. but you can't help wondering what it felt like to carry the weight of an entire church's suspicion just for trying to make peace. One friar walks by and grumbles. He opened the door to compromise. Next time, they'll be baptizing goats. You're not sure if that's hyperbole or just a very niche theological concern. Outside, the city buzzes with merchants, pilgrims, and preachers. No one's rioting, but the unease hangs in the air like incense that's gone stale. The church doesn't forget easily, and it forgives even slower when heresy's involved. As you duck into a shadowy cloister for a moment of peace, you hear young clerics debating whether the Pope should be a theologian, a politician, or just a really good actor. One suggests all three. You silently add diplomat to the list. And so Anastasius II joins the long list of popes whose legacies are more complicated than their robes are white. He didn't throw parties or stage murder trials. He didn't father secret dynasties. But he did something arguably more dangerous. He tried to reconcile with enemies. In the medieval church, that was its own kind of scandal. As the cloister bells ring for none, you sit quietly, watching dust dance in a shaft of sunlight. The scandals you've witnessed so far have come in wine goblets and whispered plots. This one came wrapped in diplomacy and doctrinal footnotes. And somehow, it might be the most controversial yet. You wander back into the city after Vespers, passing under archways carved with angels that look a little too judgmental for your comfort. Rome, by now, feels like a city built on contradictions, golden crosses above underground feuds, holy water blessed by men with suspiciously sharp jewelry. So it's no surprise when you hear murmurs about something darker, still brothels, not just any brothels, papal brothels. You blink. Surely this is exaggeration. Some bad joke echoing through the taverns. But no, as you follow the trail quite literally, a trail of red-tinted torchlight leading away from the Vatican's edge, you discover that the Church, in all its earthly wisdom, did indeed establish and regulate its own network of licensed brothels in the medieval era. The logic: if vice is inevitable, better to manage it. Set limi, collect taxes, keep things controlled. You pass one such establishment, tucked between a bakery and a candle shop. From the outside, it's unremarkable. A weathered stone facade with ivy creeping up the walls. But inside, there's velvet, laughter, perfume, and men in clerical robes, not exactly dressed for mass. It's the 15th century, and the papacy is in full swing under Pope Sixtus IV, the same pope who commissioned the Sistine Chapel. Yes, that guy. He also authorized a citywide tax on brothels and prostitutes, allegedly to help fund the building of churches, bridges, and hospitals. This is the moral economy in action. Commit sin, pay penance, pave roads. You sit at a corner table in a smoky tavern, where two priests drink wine and argue over which part of the city has the most respectable brothels. One swears by the district near the Tiber, the other mutters about a red-haired girl near the Spanish Steps. You wonder if you're dreaming, or if Rome has finally become too comfortable with its own contradictions. Historians still argue whether the brothels were directly owned by the Church or simply tolerated and taxed under papal protection. But documents survivent ledger, receipts, even correspondence between officials discussing upkeep, security, and client discretion It's less a secret and more an open, crimson-robed shrug. You walk through the neighborhood by night and watch a group of friars shuffle past. Heads low, sandals slapping the cobblestones. They stop at a discreet door and knock. A woman opens it. No one speaks. They step inside. You don't follow. You don't need to. Later, back at a chapel, you hear a young novice confess to impure thoughts, weeping over imagined sins, while the very men hearing his confession may have indulged in far more elaborate transgressions. The hypocrisy is so dense, it could be bottled and sold with a Latin label. But this isn't just about sex. It's about power. The church regulates these brothels not out of compassion, but control. Prostitutes are required to register, pay taxes, and even follow dress codes. Scarlet clocks. Mostly because subtlety isn't a medieval strong suit. One account you stumble upon tells of a woman who refused to pay her papal brothel tax and had her windows bricked up as punishment. You pass by her old house later. The facade, eerie in its silence, like it remembers every closed-lipped deal that happened behind those walls. It's worth noting that not everyone in the church approves of this system. Reformers, especially in the later centuries, rail against the tolerance of sign for profit. But as always, the machinery of indulgence is hard to stop once it's running. You end the evening sitting near a fountain, watching pilgrims pray in the moonlight. Their faces are serene. They have no idea what's happening a few streets away. Or maybe they do. Maybe they choose not to look. A nearby vendor offers you a holy water flask. Hand-blessed and totally legitimate, unless, of course, it's just Tiber water with a nice label. You pass. As the wind picks up and bells toll midnight, you realize something strange for all the church's beauty. Its scandals often lie in plain sight, not whispered in dark corners, but declared with ledgers and lanterns, and somehow, that makes them harder to explain, easier to normalize. You wrap your cloak tighter. The night feels colder now, and you swear you can hear laughter echoing down the alleyways. Not joyous. Not cruel, just tired. Like the city itself is too old to pretend anymore. You wake up the next morning to the sound of a heavy bell and a much lighter whisper, the Pope has enemies. Which, honestly, at this point shouldn't surprise you. After all the bed-hopping, corpse trials, and side-hustle indulgences, it was only a matter of time before someone decided divine wrath could use a helping hand, preferably delivered via poison. And so, you find yourself in the early 1500s, trailing behind one of the most shadowy figures ever, to shuffle through the marble halls of the Vatican Pope Alexander VI's son, Cesare Borgia. Yes, him again. Technically not a pope, but so deeply tangled in papal power, he may as well have had his own vestments embroidered. And, rumor has it, he had a favorite ring, with a secret compartment filled with poison. You glance around the papal court and see more daggers than crucifixes. Everyone here smiles like a man holding a blade behind his back. Cardinals raise their chalices a little too carefully. Bishops smell their wine before sipping. One poor fellow actually brings a silver spoon from home because, yes, it was believed silver would tarnish in the presence of poison. A medieval life hack, if there ever was one. The alleged ring, Anello del Veleno, is whispered about like a ghost story told in Latin. It supposedly delivered just enough poison to kill over dinner, but not enough to leave a trail. Cesare, according to the legends, would slip it on with all the subtlety of a polite handshake, then offer a toast to brotherhood. Hours later, someone would be dead, and no one would remember what they drank, just that it tasted slightly almondy. Historians still argue whether the poison ring ever really existed or whether it was just a metaphor for the deadly charm of the Borgia dynasty. But let's be honest, if anyone had one, it was Cesare. You're invited, okay? Again, you sneak into a late-night feast hosted by the papal household. Roast pheasant, gilded goblets, a roast boar with an apple in its mouth that somehow looks alarmed, and seated at the head Cesare, he toasts, grins, and watches everyone drink like he's counting down. You don't touch your wine. Later that night, you hear screaming. A cardinal has collapsed. Was it gout, too much brandy, or was it the flick of a poisoned ring? The next morning, no one talks about it. Just a gentle reminder from the master of ceremonies that the Eucharist will be served promptly at noon. Death, here, is just part of the liturgy. But it's not just poison that stains the papal courts. Spies rampant. Letters go missing. One monk is caught copying confidential correspondence and disappears before dinner. You find a half-burnt note in the fireplace that reads, "The French ambassador knows too much." You quietly fold it and pretend you never saw it. Even Pope Julius II, the so-called warrior pope, who followed the Borgias and tried to clean house, had his own security concerns. He wore armor into battle. Yes, but he also had his wine tasted 3 times before every sip. And you thought your office politics were stressful. In one quiet hallway of the Apostolic Palace, you notice a fresco of the Last Supper. Only this version feels more ominous than reverent. You count the faces around the table and feel a chill, not because of the theology, but because you've just come from a real supper where you weren't sure who would walk out alive. You pass a scribe, copying a recipe for something called bishop's cordial. You don't ask about ingredients, and the people, they don't rebel. They adapt. They whisper. Trade rumors. Raise their children to be clever rather than kind. In Rome, survival is a skill set, and avoiding the wrong goblet might just be part of catechism. Later, as dusk falls, you find yourself standing by a fountain where pigeons bathe without a care. You wonder if they ever worry about poison. Probably not. Just crumbs and the occasional ambitious cat. But you've learned, when dining with popes, maybe skip the wine, and definitely check the ring. The next day begins strangely. You overhear someone at a market stall say, "He died." No, wait. He's back. No, dead again. Naturally, your curiosity kicks in. And because you're in Rome during one of its more melodramatic centuries, this isn't about an actor or a nobleman. It's about a pope, specifically, Pope Benedict XI. Yes, him again. If that name sounds familiar, it should. He's the same party-loving pope you met earlier, who entered the papacy as a teenager and treated the Vatican like a high-end Roman nightclub. But here's the kicker. He didn't just reign once, or twice. He was pope 3 different times. Imagine quitting your job, being replaced, getting your old job back, selling that job to someone else, and then trying to steal it again, except the job is head of the Catholic Church and comes with a palace, a ring, and the awkward expectation of moral behavior. You walk through an alleyway lined with aging frescoes and hear two friars arguing about Benedict's bizarre timeline. He abdicated. No, he was deposed. He sold the papacy for a bag of coins and a horse. One of them throws up his hands and mutters, "Honestly, I think he just forgot he'd already resigned." Historians still argue whether Benedict was a manipulative schemer or simply caught in the political hurricane of Roman noble families, trying to play papal musical chairs. But what's undisputed is this: his papacy was so unstable, so back and forth, that church officials had to re-bless holy documents multiple times just to make sure the signatures were from the right version of the Pope. At one point, he even tried to reclaim the papacy by force storming the Lateran Palace with mercenaries while his successor was away. Imagine returning from vacation to find your predecessor in your office chair, feet up, offering you a biscuit. You find a journal entry from an exhausted cleric dated 1047 that reads, simply, "He has returned." Again, "Lord, preserve us." It's smudged with ink and what might be dried wine. The people of Rome, already numbed by scandal after scandal, begin to treat the papacy less like a holy office and more like an unpredictable weather pattern, whose pope today becomes a legitimate morning question. Right after checking the skies for plague birds, you sit in a tavern listening to bards sing an ironic little ditty about the pope who couldn't decide. Performed to the tune of a funeral hymn. The crowd laughs. But it's not joyful. It's tired. Meanwhile, the church scrambles to recover its dignity. Multiple synods are called. Decrees are issued. Benedict IX is formally excommunicated, then not, then possibly re-excommunicated later. It's hard to keep track, especially without a whiteboard and 3 sets of colored pens. You sneak into an archive room where scribes are recopying Benedict's papal bulls. One sighs and mutters, "We've recopied this proclamation 4 times. At this point, we should just use pencil." Even the architecture seems confused. There's a chapel, Benedict blessed on his 2nd reign, but unblessed on his 3rd. One bishop swears the pews now creak in confusion, and then poof, he's gone. No grand exit, no poisoned ring, just fades from the narrative like a character who wandered off stage and forgot his next cue. His final days remain murky. Some say he died in a monastery. Others that he simply disappeared into obscurity, perhaps exhausted by the very chaos he helped create. You wander to the outskirts of Rome and find a small chapel rumored to be his final refuge. It's quiet, unremarkable, and there's a dusty wooden sign that reads, "No politics inside." You can't help but laugh. Benedict IX's legacy. He holds the record for most non-consecutive papal terms. He's a walking footnote, a cautionary tale, and the closest thing the Vatican ever had to a boomerang, or a boomerang that occasionally catches fire, then comes back anyway. The sky darkens, and you wrap your cloak tighter. You think about all the others, those who schemed, ruled, and died in dramatic fashion. But Benedict, he just kept showing up. Like papal whiplash, as you return to the city, you notice a statue of a different Pope Stoic, commanding, eyes carved in eternal prayer. A pigeon lands on its head. Probably a metaphor. Probably accurate. Just when you think papal history has exhausted every possible plot twist, nepotism, poison, red light zoning, you hear a story so improbable, it makes everything else look tame. You're standing near the edge of the Tiber, watching gondolas float past lazily, when a young friar leans toward you and whispers, "Did you know there was once a female pope?" You blink. Surely. He's mistaken. But no, he insists. Eyes wide. Voice low. The way people speak of old ghosts or ancient secrets. And just like that, you're pulled into one of the most enduring mysteries of medieval lore, Pope Joan. According to the legend, sometime in the 9th century, a brilliant woman disguised herself as a man, entered the clergy, climbed the ranks, and was eventually elected Pope. She reigned for several years, undetected, until her secret unraveled spectacularly. You follow the tale to a cobbled street in Rome that some claim is cursed. It's here, according to lore, that Pope Joan went into labor during a procession between St. Wellman's, Peter's, and the Lateran Palace. Yes, labor, right there in the middle of the road, flanked by chanting clergy and unsuspecting cardinals. You picture the moment a flurry of shock, dropped incense, a holy banner catching fire in the chaos. One version claims the crowd tore her apart in rage. Another says she was quietly removed, her name stricken from the official papal registry, like a medieval Control-Z. Historians still argue whether Pope Joan was real or just an elaborate myth meant to shame or caution future clergy. Some point to gaps in papal records around that era years, where the Vatican seems unusually quiet, like someone's been edited out. Others dismiss it entirely as satirical fiction that gained traction in a time when church drama was practically a genre of its own. You visit a small chapel tucked into an alley, said to be built near the birthing site. There's no plaque, no relic, just a hush that lingers in the shadows, like the story's still trying to catch its breath. In the Lateran Basilica, you find a curious detail, an old seat, part of the ceremonial ritual for vetting popes, designed with a suspiciously anatomical opening. It's called the sedia stercoraria, and some claim it was used to verify a pope's masculinity after the Pope Joan affair. You lean in to examine it and immediately regret it. Hygiene standards weren't quite what they are today. A tour guide nearby swears the ritual involved a cardinal physically checking and then announcing, "Testiculos habet, he has testicles." You can't decide if that's horrifying or just the most awkward HR policy ever implemented. Back in the archives, you flip through conflicting texts. One medieval chronicler insists she reigned for 2.5 years. Another says 7. A German monk from the 13th century even includes her in his official timeline, wedged neatly between Leo IV and Benedict III. Either this was the world's most persistent myth, or something very weird really did happen. You leave the archives unsure, but the tale lingers in your mind. Stubborn as candle wax, out on the streets, you pass a puppet show, reenacting her story for tips and chuckles. Kids laugh. Adults watch in silence. History, it seems, makes room for both scandal and theater. Later, as night falls and the Tiber glows gold beneath the moonlight. You wonder if Pope Joan was real. How did she manage it? How did no one notice? Was it her intellect, her disguise? Or was the Vatican so distracted by its own chaos that it missed the truth sitting right on the throne? You may never get an answer. But you know this real or myth. Her story says something about the world she supposedly lived in, a place so preoccupied with appearances that even the impossible could wear a robe and walk among the cardinals. A gust of wind rattles the leaves as you cross the bridge back into central Rome. Behind you, the river murmurs. The secrets of centuries past swirl just beneath the surface, patient and persistent. And somewhere in that swirl, Pope Joan waits half history. Half legend. Wholly unforgettable. You're deep in the Vatican library now, hidden behind shelves that smell like leather bindings and centuries of well-meaning censorship. You're tracing marginalia, doodles of demons and grapes. When a parchment catches your eye, it doesn't concern doctrine or papal decrees or the theological merit of whether angels can dance on the head of a pin. It's about pirates. Yes, pirates. Because there was, indeed, a time when the Pope had to deal not just with spiritual heresy, but with actual seafaring criminals, wielding cutlasses and probably smelling like salted meat. The Mediterranean in the 9th and 10th centuries was crawling with Saracen pirates. And their raids didn't stop at coastal villages. They came right for Rome. And Pope Leo IV. He wasn't about to sit back and watch the Holy City get looted like a forgotten lunchbox. You step outside, and the year is 846. The pirates have done the unthinkable. They've sacked the outskirts of Rome. They raided the basilicas of St. Kai, Peter, and St. Paul, not the central church itself, but the parts beyond the city walls. Still, it was enough to make everyone panic like the apocalypse had RSVP'd early. Leo IV, however, wasn't your typical robe-wearing, prayer-reciting pontiff. He was a builder, a planner, and just a little bit of a military enthusiast. He orders the construction of Leonine City, a fortified wall around Vatican Hill. You walk along the wall now, massive, gray, and intimidating. Built not just to defend, but to declare, try it again, and we'll be ready. He even organizes a fleet, a papal navy. If you can believe it, it's like the plot of a slightly off-brand action movie, The Pope Who Fought Pirates. But it's real. In 849, his navy helps defeat the invaders in the Battle of Ostia, a port town southwest of Rome. The fresco Raphael later paints of it in the Vatican is less historical record and more divine propaganda. But it still shows a pope in full storm command mode. You imagine him pacing the deck, cassock billowing, yelling fire, the ballista between Hail Marys. It's probably more fantasy than fact, but it makes for a stunning mental image. Historians still debate how involved Leo IV actually was. In naval command, was he the brains behind the scenes? Or just the guy who blessed the sails and hoped for the best? Either way, his response to the pirate threat reshaped the Vatican's physical and political boundaries. You cross into Leonine City as it stands today. Now, a part of modern Rome. But back then, a last-ditch buffer between holy relics and sea-thirsty raiders. You stand under the archway that once separated the sacred from the terrified and wonder what it smelled like back then. Smoke, sweat, sea brine, and fear. Local lore even says that Leo IV performed miracles during the pirate attacks, including calming storms and scattering enemy fleets with divine wind. Whether it was divine intervention or just a lucky gust of weather, no one can say. But his popularity skyrocketed. The people didn't just see him as a pope, they saw him as a protector. You stroll past a market where modern vendors hawk little trinkets, pope keychains, pirate-themed bottle openers, and for some reason, a rubber duck dressed like a cardinal. You don't ask. In the nearby square, a tour guide tells an enraptured crowd this was the only time in history that a pope actually helped lead a successful military defense against pirates. You resist the urge to interrupt with a sarcastic that we know of. As twilight spills over the rooftops, you realize something subtle but powerful. The papacy wasn't just about prayers and doctrine. It was about survival. Sometimes that meant theological debates. Other times, it meant building walls, organizing militias, and praying your navy didn't get seasick. Leo IV would die in his bed. Not on a battlefield, but the legend he left behind, the warrior pope who stood between pirates and St. Brace. Peter's tomb remains etched in the city's stones, if not always in its sermons. You stand alone on the wall he built, the breeze tugging gently at your cloak. Rome stretches out below. Quiet now. No sails on the horizon. But for a brief, surreal chapter. This city's most sacred office also came with a sword, or at least a firm, papal finger pointed sternly out to sea. You wake up the next morning to a strange orange glow flickering against the marble walls of your borrowed lodging. At first, you think it's just dawn breaking over Rome's rooftops. But then the light sharpens, slashing across the sky in a blazing arc. And you realize, nope, that's a comet. More specifically, it's Halley's Comet, blazing its smug little tail right across the heavens like it owns the place. And as you squint at it through a haze of early morning incense and superstition, someone near you murmurs, "The end is nigh." You turn to see a monk clutching a prayer book so tightly it's warping the leather. The Holy Father has excommunicated it, he adds, as if that makes sense. And somehow, in the logic of the medieval church, it does. Welcome to 1456. Pope Calixtus III is in charge. And Halley's Comet has just made its most inconvenient appearance, yet streaking through the sky during a time of war, plague, and deeply superstitious vibes. The comet's arrival is interpreted as a literal omen of doom. And, while many people pray, panic, or pack up their chickens, the Pope responds with papal authority. You follow a parade of chanting clerics to St. Peter's Square, where a ceremony is underway. Candles flicker. Bells toll. Latin echoes across the cobblestones. But instead of blessing pilgrims or sanctifying relics, the Pope is busy issuing a formal denunciation of an astronomical object. That's right. Excommunicates Halley's Comet. The decree, as it's later recorded, includes prayers to repel celestial threats, public fasting, and a general call to arms, not against Turks this time, but against the flaming sky noodle everyone's convinced is a sign of God's disappointment, or Satan's flashlight. Historians still argue whether Calixtus literally excommunicated the comet or if the event has been exaggerated over the centuries. Some say it was just a misinterpretation of a more general anti-omen prayer. Others insist it was a full-blown papal tantrum directed at space. Either way, the image is too good not to savor a group of solemn men in ornate robes, shaking fists at the heavens like they expect the comet to file an appeal. You wonder if someone assigned an exorcist to the observatory telescope. You drift through the city as comet fever spreads. Merchants sell protective amulets, tiny charms shaped like stars or miniature papal bulls. A woman insists sprinkling blessed wine on your roof tiles will stop them from igniting spontaneously. One particularly nervous baker refuses to make crescent-shaped bread because it looks too comedy. Every evening, people gather to stare at the sky and cry. Some see angels. Some see dragons. One man claims to see the Virgin Mary holding a flaming sword and tells everyone to stop eating sausages on Fridays. The Church does not endorse this vision. Back at the Vatican, the astronomers are trying to stay sane. You find one huddled over a star chart, muttering, "It's a ball of ice and dust." Not the herald of pestilence. He gets shushed immediately by a cardinal who mutters, "Let people cope." What's fascinating is how Halley's Comet becomes a kind of mirror for people's deepest fears. The plague has returned in parts of Europe. The Ottoman Empire has just captured Constantinople. Every shadow feels like a threat. So when a streak of flame slices the sky, people don't see a rock. They see judgment. The Pope doubles down. More prayers. More fasting. Processions with relics and banners that say things like, "Deliver us, O Lord, from the wrath of the heavens." Someone makes a comet-shaped reliquary, which you are 90% sure is just a gilded ladle with spikes. You sit in a chapel late that night. The comet visible through a rose-shaped window. It glows steadily unbothered. Unrepentant. You think about the absurdity of excommunicating an object that doesn't even orbit under Earth's laws, let alone canon law. But you also think about the power of belief. In a world where invisible sins cause visible plagues, where relics bleed and saints whisper through statues, maybe yelling at the sky feels like a kind of control, even if the sky doesn't listen. Eventually, Halley's Comet moves on. The nights return to quiet. The Pope does not rescind his decree. No one talks about it much after that, as if embarrassed by how collectively weird things got. But you remember, and so does the comet. It'll be back. You step out of the chapel into a Rome that's slightly less terrified of space rocks, but still very much tangled in the business of good versus evil. Today, however, the evil isn't a flaming ball of cosmic dust. It's something closer to home. Something allegedly lurking in the shadows of the human soul. You follow a whisper trail through cloisters and colonnades until you find yourself face to face with one of the Church's more theatrical pastimes, exorcisms. And not the low-key whisper, a prayer and toss, some holy water variety. No. This is the high-drama stuff, public, performative, and occasionally ticketed. It's the late 16th century, and Pope Clement VIII is on the throne. He's a complicated man, devout, reform-minded, occasionally harsh, but also absolutely convinced that demonic possession is not just real, but rampant. So, when reports emerge of a young nun in the town of Loudun convulsing, cursing in Latin, and claiming to be tormented by demons. The papacy sends in the big guns. You arrive just in time to witness an exorcism in the side chapel of a Roman monastery. The air is thick with incense. A priest with a booming voice holds up a crucifix and begins shouting phrases that alternate between scripture and surprisingly aggressive personal insults. The possessed girl writhes on the stone floor, growling, shrieking, speaking in what some believe to be Aramaic. Others say it's just very bad French. You're told not to stand too close, just in case. The crowd. Yes. There's a crowd, watches from the shadows. Some pray. Some clutch relics. A few definitely look like they're here for the entertainment. One man sells roasted chestnuts just outside the door. He calls them devil poppers, tastefully branded. You suppose? The ritual lasts hours. At one point, a statue wobbles on its pedestal, and someone gasps, whether it was caused by spiritual energy or the weight of 17 people leaning in too hard. No one knows. The demon, apparently named Asmodeus, they always have names, is eventually banished. The girl collapses. The crowd exhales. Historians still argue whether these possessions were genuine, staged, or the result of undiagnosed medical conditions. Some claim the nuns were pressured by local clergy. Others point to mass hysteria, group psychology, and maybe even hallucinogenic mold in the convent bread. But the church believed it, and more importantly, wanted you to believe it. You leaf through an old papal decree on demonology. The margins are filled with doodles of horned beasts and terrified monks. The document outlines proper exorcism procedures, which include fasting, confession, and never conducting the rite alone. That last bit feels like solid advice. Even if you don't fully buy into the demon thing, later that week, you're granted access to a private viewing of a papal archive labeled Diaboli et Inquisition. Inside, you find transcripts from earlier papal trials involving suspected witches, heretics, and possessed individuals. One document details a case where a man was found to be infested after sneezing 13 times during a single mass. No word on whether he had allergies or just really strong feelings about incense. Not all popes were theatrical about this. Some preferred quiet investigation. Others leaned into spectacle. Pope Innocent VIII, for example, allegedly issued a bull officially recognizing witches and possession as widespread threats and even appointed inquisitors specifically to root them out. Papal Ghostbusters. If you will, you walk through a Roman alley at dusk and pass a woman muttering protective prayers over her doorstep. She sprinkled ash across the threshold and hung garlic above the lintel. It's unclear whether she's afraid of vampires or cardinals. You nod politely either way. The church's obsession with the devil wasn't just about fear, it was about control. When you can label dissent, disease, or disorder as demonic, you gain incredible power. It turns vague threats into specific enemies. It gives you license to purge, cleanse, and sometimes entertain. You revisit the chapel where the exorcism occurred. It's empty now. Quiet. A faint scorch mark on the floor is the only trace, whether from hellfire or an overturned candle. No one can say. Above the altar, a fresco depicts Saint Michael driving a spear into Satan's chest. It's dramatic, to say the least. You stare at it, wondering how much of the devil the popes really believed in, and how much they needed him to keep people in line. A bell tolls softly in the distance. You turn your collar up against the night chill. Rome might be Keter now, but its demons never really go away. Sometimes they scream in Latin. Sometimes they hide in plain sight. And sometimes, just sometimes, they wear robes and bless the crowd before calling it holy theater. By now, you've seen popes chase pirates, scold comets, flirt with demons, and dabble in real estate involving brothels. You might be hoping for a chapter of quiet reflection, a humble pontiff sipping wine in a vineyard, maybe writing poetry about lilies. Instead, you arrive in France, not just France Avignon, and yes, it's still technically the papacy. But the air smells more like brie than incense, and the wine is suspiciously good. Welcome to the Avignon papacy. That one time the popes packed up the whole Holy See and moved it into French wine country. You blink at the situation. It's 1309. And Pope Clement V, who's never actually stepped foot in Rome, decides the Eternal City is too dangerous, too political, too everything. So he relocates the papal court to Avignon, just a stone's throw from the Rhone River and roughly a universe away from St. Peter's, and then they stay there. Not just for a long weekend or a papal retreat. For nearly 70 years, you stroll through the vast Palais des Papes, a Gothic fortress that looks more like a castle designed by someone playing a holy-themed Dungeons & Dragons campaign. It's majestics, towering, and very obviously built for power, not prayer. Courtiers in velvet robes whisper in French. Cardinals sip wine out of goblets that look suspiciously chalice-adjacent. Historians still argue whether the move was made for safety, politics, or because the local baguettes were just that convincing. In truth, it was probably a mix. Rome at the time was volatile, full of factional warfare, plague outbreaks, and so many street brawls between noble families that you start to think they had weekly schedules. But let's not pretend this was a selfless exile. The Avignon popes lived very well. Lavish feasts, imported tapestries, art commissions, and a rapidly expanding bureaucracy known for being efficient and very fond of coin. Think of it as the Vatican's vacation home. Except they forgot to go back. You pass through a dining hall where Pope John XXII once entertained guests with flaming desserts and philosophical debates about usury, while quietly consolidating control over papal finances. You find a letter from a frustrated Roman merchant: "I have paid indulgences in 3 currencies and still no absolution." Oops. Critics of the Avignon popes accuse them of being too cozy with the French crown. And, well, they're not wrong. 7 popes in a row are French. French advisors fill the court. French wines are blessed regularly, though possibly less for spiritual reasons, and more because Cabernet Eternal has a nice ring to it. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the locals aren't pleased. Without the Pope, the city descends into a slow crumble. Pilgrims stop coming. Basilicas fall into disrepair. And graffiti artists take full advantage of unsupervised church walls. One reads, "Come home or be replaced." Eventually, The Avignon residency becomes so controversial that people start demanding the Pope return to Rome among them. A tenacious mystic named Catherine of Siena, who sends sharply worded letters saying, "In essence, you are not wine monks. Go back to your throne." I'm paraphrasing. Under growing pressure, Pope Gregory XI finally returns to Rome in 1377. To great applause and mild confusion, the Eternal City greets him with cracked roads, flaking frescoes, and a suspiciously large number of stray cats. But the story doesn't end there. With Gregory's death comes chaos. Two rival popes are elected. One in Rome, one in Avignon. Cue the Great Schism. And yes, we'll get there soon. For now, you sit in a vineyard near Avignon, sipping a glass of wine, probably aged in the same cellar where a bishop once hid his second-best mitre. The sun dips below the hills. The scent of lavender drifts through the air. It's easy to see why they stayed so long. You think about the absurdity of it all. A church built on sacrifice and humility, establishing its seat of power in a fortified pleasure fortress with better catering than most royal courts. And yet, from here, they issued bulls, blessed kings, and managed the vast machinery of faith like celestial CEOs. The Avignon papacy proves something that you've probably already guessed. The papacy isn't just a spiritual office. It's a political one, a geographical one, a deeply human one, subject to all the temptations of comfort, control, and good cheese. And as you walk back into town, past a street musician playing a hymn on a cracked lute, you realize wherever the popes go, Rome follows. But sometimes, it takes a very long time to catch up. You're barely back in Rome, still brushing the Avignon dust from your cloak, when you're thrust into the next great papal absurdity, 3 popes, all at once. It's the late 14th century now. And if you thought the papacy was chaotic before, buckle up. It begins innocently enough, or as innocently as it ever gets in medieval church politics. After Pope Gregory XI dies in 1378, the College of Cardinals gathers in Rome to elect a new pope. The people of Rome, furious that the seat of Peter has been absent for nearly 7 decades, aren't exactly calm and detached observers. In fact, they gather outside the conclave and shout helpful, encouraging phrases like, "Elect a Roman or die." So, under pressure and possibly mild fear for their necks, the cardinals elect Urban VI, an Italian. At first, everything seems fine. Urban is competent, organized, and speaks fluent Latin in that fast, irritated tone that suggests he has a lot of reforms and not enough patience. Then things unravel. Urban turns out to be intense. A reformer with the energy of a caffeinated prophet and the subtlety of a brick through a stained glass window. He rants. He insults. He accuses cardinals of corruption accurately, to be fair, and tries to centralize power with such zeal that the same cardinals who elected him start asking whether they can get a do-over. And so, they flee Rome, not metaphorically, literally. They sneak out, regroup in Anagni, and declare that Urban's election was invalid because it was made under public pressure. Then, they elect another pope, a French one, Pope Clement VII. He returns to, yep, you guessed it, Avignon. Now there are two popes, both claiming to be the one true vicar of Christ, both excommunicating each other with the passion of a bad breakup, and both issuing papal bulls like they're playing spiritual dodgeball. You wander the streets of Rome and see graffiti that reads, "Urban or bust." In Avignon, banners wave. Clement is canon. The faithful are torn. Entire kingdoms have to pick sides. France and Scotland back Avignon. England and the Holy Roman Empire stick with Rome. The Church, supposedly united under one shepherd, is now two shepherds calling each other wolves. And just when you think this theological divorce can't get more complicated, surprise, a council is called to fix things. The Council of Pisa in 1409 decides that the solution to having two popes is, wait for it, to fire them both and elect a third pope. Pope Alexander V. Great plan. Except the first two don't step down. So now you have three popes. You walk past a confused street preacher in Florence, trying to explain this to his flock using a loaf of bread, 2 figs, and a rock. It does not go well. Someone in the back just shouts, "So who do we tithe to?" And honestly, great question. Historians still debate whether the Council of Pisa had any actual legal authority, or if it was just an extremely ambitious theological group project gone rogue. Regardless, by 1410, the Church looks like a fractured mirror, one pope in Rome, one in Avignon, and one claiming neutrality from Pisa. All of them insisting they hold the keys to heaven. The faithful, understandably, start to lose faith, not in God, but in management. A German monk writes, "If heaven is divided, what hope for earth?" A bit dramatic. But he's not wrong. Eventually, the mess is too large to ignore. Another council, this time at Constance, is called in 1414. It drags on for years. Finally, it convinces the Roman Pope to resign, deposes the Pisan Pope, and ignores the Avignon one entirely. They elect a new Pope, Martin V. In 1417, the Great Schism, as it comes to be known, is over. Sort of. The wounds take generations to heal, and the memory of those decades of fractured authority, spiritual whiplash, and papal mudslinging doesn't exactly inspire confidence. You stroll past a fresco being painted to commemorate Martin V's return to Rome. The artist is trying to capture unity, but the faces all look slightly annoyed, probably because nobody remembered to feed the pigeons during the schism. The Vatican, by now, has learned a hard lesson. When popes multiply, confusion follows. And when confusion reigns, belief frays. It's not just doctrine at stake, it's identity. Who speaks for God when 3 men are shouting over each other? You pause at the steps of St. Francis, John Lateran, watching a lone friar sweep up the morning dust. He hums a hymn and doesn't look up when you ask, "Which pope did you follow?" He shrugs. "The one who made the bread cheaper." Fair enough. You think, perhaps naively, that things might settle down after the whole 3-pope fiasco. Surely now the papacy will turn inward. Reflect. Pray a little more. Scheme a little less. But then you hear a name spoken in hushed tones. With equal parts fear and fascination, Borgia. Welcome to the late 15th century. And brace yourself, because the papacy is about to go full Renaissance gangster. Rodrigo Borgia, soon to be Pope Alexander VI, doesn't so much ascend to the papacy as purchase it. The 1492 conclave isn't remembered for its piety, it's remembered for the sheer volume of bribes Rodrigo dishes out like hors d'oeuvres at a banquet. Bishoprics, promises, cold, hard cash. He distributes it all, like holy coupons for influence. You're there, somewhere in the background, as cardinals nervously glance at each other and quietly take the bait. Some historians still argue whether Rodrigo's election was truly the most corrupt of the era, but given the size of the bribe buffet, you suspect no one's rushing to defend it. Once crowned, Alexander VI gets to work, turning the papacy into something halfway between a divine monarchy and a mafia family reunion. His primary goals elevate the Borgia name, expand his power, and maintain a vice grip on Rome. Morality optional. Incense mandatory. You walk the halls of the Apostolic Palace, and it's like stepping into a soap opera with better lighting. Rodrigo openly acknowledges his children, most famously Cesare and Lucrezia, and treats the Vatican less like a spiritual headquarters and more like a dynastic launchpad. Cesare Borgia, freshly traded out of his cardinal robes for armor, becomes the muscle behind the operation. He's ruthless, brilliant, and rumored to carry that infamous poison ring. Lucrezia, she's the political wildcard, married off strategically, rumored often unfairly to be involved in all kinds of unsavory business. One noble even refers to her as Rome's most dangerous dowry. Charming, there are feasts. Oh, are there feasts? The most infamous is the Banquet of the Chestnuts, an event so scandalous that historians still squirm trying to describe it politely. Allegedly, hosted by Cesare, with dancers, food, and competitions that are best left in Latin footnotes. Whether the stories are exaggerated or entirely fabricated, the Borgia brand becomes synonymous with luxury, scandal, and just the faintest whiff of mortal peril. You peek into Alexander VI's papal apartments. They are stunning, painted by Pinturicchio, adorned with frescoes of classical figures, and Borgia bulls his family crest. The irony of pagan gods cavorting on Vatican walls isn't lost on anyone. But no one dares criticize it out loud. Not unless they enjoy surprise illnesses. The Pope himself is a contradiction. He expands the Church's administrative reach. He's clever, diplomatic, and good at maintaining alliances. Until he isn't, he plays France, Spain, and the Italian city-states against one another, like a chess master, often sacrificing bishops, the way others toss pawns. But beneath the robes and rings, Alexander VI is always Rodrigo, a man who treats the church like legacy real estate. He's not building sainthood, he's building empire. Historians still debate whether he was a product of his time or the one who perfected its worst tendencies. Was he an ambitious father trapped in a flawed system, or the architect of its moral decline? Either way, his enemies multiply faster than his titles. You overhear one diplomat call him the Pope of Appearances, always performing, always smiling, always calculating, and then, quite suddenly, it ends. In 1503, Both Alexander and Cesare fall violently ill, perhaps poisoned, perhaps victims of Rome's cursed summer air. Alexander dies, Cesare survives, but barely, and without his father's papal protection, he's quickly pushed out of power. The Borgia legacy crumbles faster than a communion wafer in the rain. You walk past the Pope's tomb in St. Wedi Prial, Peter's, and it's shockingly modest for such a grand figure. No towering monument, just a name. The scandal, after all, doesn't need marble to last. Rome breathes easier, for a moment, but the damage is done. The Borgia papacy becomes legend, whispered across Europe as the ultimate cautionary tale. A pope who fathered generals, a cardinal who traded red robes for blood-stained armor, a daughter who married power and perhaps, just perhaps, survived it all. You sit under a fig tree in a quiet courtyard, listening to birdsong and distant bells. You think about power, how it changes hands, how it corrupts, how it hides behind holy robes and frescoed ceilings, and you realize every pope you've met so far has taught you something. But Alexander VI, he taught you what happens when the throne of Peter becomes a throne of ambition, and how sometimes the sharpest sin wears the softest silk. You don't leave Rome. Not yet. There's one final thread you need to pull, a quieter scandal, but no less revealing. It begins not in the palace or the catacombs, but in a dim corner of a market square, where a vendor waves you over to a rickety cart covered in tiny glass cases. Holy relics, he says with a grin. All genuine. Finger of St. Thomas. Thorn from the true crown. Milk from the Virgin Mary, very fresh. You blink. The man taps a tiny vial that seems to contain milk. It sloshes, faintly pink. You ask how it's possible. He replies without hesitation. Miracles are timeless. So is business. Welcome to the booming trade of medieval relics, where bits of bone, cloth, hair, and occasionally suspicious fluids were bought, sold, kissed, and carried across continents, sometimes to inspire devotion, sometimes to fund cathedrals, and sometimes because someone was really good at carving chicken bones. You trail the vendors through the stalls of Rome, watching peasants hand over their savings in exchange for splinters allegedly taken from the true cross. One seller offers you a vial of Jesus' tears. You decline. He winks and offers a 2-for-1 deal on apostle toenails instead. Relics were, in theory, sacred items, remains, or belongings of saints, martyrs, or holy figures. The Church officially approved some. But let's be honest, during the Middle Ages, the system for verifying relics was about as rigorous as a medieval pub quiz. And when the papacy wasn't directly organizing the trade, it was absolutely benefiting from it. You pass a side chapel where pilgrims kneel before what is supposedly the holy umbilical cord of Christ. A friar guards it jealously. Another friar, with a slightly more cynical eyebrow, mutters, "There are at least 7 of those in Europe." You don't ask follow-up questions. Historians still argue whether the majority of relics were sincere devotional tools or tools of economic manipulation. Probably both. The belief was real, tangible, bone deep. People traveled hundreds of miles to touch these objects, to feel close to the divine. But someone, somewhere, was profiting. You arrive at the Lateran Treasury, a place so packed with relics, it feels more like a spiritual antique mall than a holy vault. Teeth of saints, shoes of apostles, a surprisingly large number of foreskins attributed to Jesus. You stare at one reliquary, shaped like a tiny golden foot, and wonder what's inside. You decide not to look. There's a story you overhear, a classic of medieval absurdity. A small church in France claimed to own the head of John the Baptist. All well and good, except 2 towns over. Another church also claimed to have John's head. When pilgrims pointed this out, the local bishop calmly explained, one is the head of John as a child, the other as an adult. Problème solved. Another favorite, a monastery, claimed to possess the skull of Saint Barbara, one of the many saints whose bones seemed to multiply like rabbits. A rival abbey, jealous of the pilgrim income, declared it had her entire skeleton. When questioned, they said, ours is her second skeleton. Sure, back in Rome, popes both encouraged and regulated this market. Popes like Innocent III and Boniface VIII issued decrees condemning fake relics, while also gifting them lavishly to allies. The hypocrisy wasn't always intentional. Sometimes, they too believed. Other times, it was useful to believe. You find a papal seal attached to a beautifully crafted reliquary. It glows faintly in the candlelight. Authenticated, it says, with a flourish and a date. You wonder how many pilgrims saw that stamp and believed not because of what they saw, but because a pope said it was so. You visit a chapel housing what's claimed to be a piece of the burning bush. It looks like a twig. A nun offers to let you touch it for a small donation. 5 coins to feel the fire of Moses. She says, you're tempted. You're also reasonably sure it came from someone's garden hedge. But you don't laugh. Not entirely. Because there's something deeply human in this chaos. The desire to hold on to something, anything that feels holy, tangible. Touching a relic is easier than understanding doctrine. It's simpler to carry a saint's femur than to carry faith alone. Still, you walk away from the relic stalls with a strange ache, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the divine got a little lost in the merchandising. That maybe the church, in trying to bottle heaven, started selling souvenirs instead. But you also know this people wept in front of those bones. They knelt. They prayed. They believed. And somewhere, beneath the scams and splinters, something holy, flickered, fragile, but real. You pass a final vendor packing up his relics for the night. He offers you a genuine feather from the Archangel Gabriel. It's clearly a pigeon feather. You smile. He smiles back. Neither of you says a word. You linger near the edge of St. Peter's Square, watching the shadows stretch long across the flagstones. The air smells like wax, wet stone, and overcooked theology. By now, you've seen more scandal than sanctity. But something keeps pulling you forward. An itch behind your eyes. A whisper in your ear. Because, as much as relics and poison rings made the headlines, the church had another tool, just as powerful, the miracle makers, or perhaps more accurately, the miracle managers. You slip into a side chapel, where a young priest is weeping quietly in front of a statue that's been reported by multiple reliable witnesses to have blinked during morning prayers. Once, just once, but long enough for someone to declare it divine. A few coins rattle into a donation box nearby. Welcome to the strange, surreal world of papal PR, where some popes learned that image was everything. And what better way to shape an image than with a well-timed miracle? Throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, popes weren't just theologians, they were also brand managers. Miracles, visions, bleeding statues, mysterious voices. These weren't just expressions of faith. They were weapons, used to inspire the masses, to silence dissent, to redirect attention at just the right moment. You discover a letter in an archive from the reign of Pope Urban II, the same pope who launched the First Crusade, mentioning a glowing cross seen in the sky over Clermont. Conveniently, it appeared the very night he was rallying support for a holy war. Historians still argue whether it was a meteor, a fabrication, or simply a case of crowd-induced enthusiasm, but the effect undeniable. During times of political tension, miracles tended to spike. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III found his policies under fire from both kings and cardinals. Coincidentally, a nun began receiving visions that declared him God's chosen defender. These visions were later written up, canonized, and distributed widely. You can still read one in a manuscript where Jesus allegedly tells the nun, "Innocent is my shepherd. Listen to him." Subtle. You pass by a dusty reliquary containing a loaf of bread that allegedly fed 200 people without diminishing in size. It's rock hard now. But the label says it was blessed by Pope Gregory the Great during a famine. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. People believed it. And so they trusted Gregory's leadership more. Some popes went even further. Pope Alexander III, during the 12th century, endorsed multiple miracle reports during his papacy that conveniently aligned with his political battles visions of St. Peter supporting his position. Rivers, changing course to save pro-papal villages. And one rather creative account of a lamb being born with a tiara-shaped mark on its head. Propaganda. Bold choice. You slip into a back room of the Vatican Library, where old documents list verified miracles in the papal age. One is a statue of the Virgin Mary that supposedly wept blood after a cardinal was assassinated. Another involves a man being cured of leprosy after drinking water blessed by a pope who also happened to be under investigation at the time. Amazing timing. Were they all lies? Not necessarily. Historians still debate how many of these stories were rooted in truth. Hallucination, manipulation, or some cocktail of all three. People wanted to believe. And popes, like any savvy rulers, knew when to fan the flame. You visit a small church outside the city walls, where an ancient fresco depicts a dove descending on a pope's head mid-mass. According to the local legend, this was proof of the Holy Spirit's endorsement. A bishop standing nearby mutters, "Funny how doves always seem to show up right before a papal decree." You nod. Sky marketing. Not all popes were comfortable with miracle theatrics. Some, like Pope Adrian VI, openly denounced popular superstitions and discouraged visions. He was not well liked. His tomb is modest and usually ignored by tour guides. Apparently, calling out miracle. Inflation doesn't earn you many devotional candles, but the truth is, clear miracles were currency. Not just in relics or saints, but in reputation. A pope with a miracle was a pope worth following. A pope with many miracles, practically bulletproof. You finish the evening back in the square, where pilgrims gather to light candles beneath a new banner proclaiming the healing water of St. Plast, Clement, a spring that allegedly began flowing near an abandoned chapel, the same day a new papal edict passed. The timing is, of course, impeccable. As you sit, a child points to a cloud and shouts, "Look, a cross." People squint. A few nod. One old woman begins to weep. You look, you squint, and maybe, just maybe, it's there. The night is still and heavy with history. Rome breathes slower now, like an old man exhaling after a long sermon. The marble is cool beneath your hands as you lean against a fountain, the water trickling steadily like time itself, refusing to stop. You've wandered through papal bedchambers and battlefields, brothels and basilicas, and somehow, you're still not done, because now, the curtain rises on the aftermath, the final scramble, the hurried attempt to mop up centuries of scandal with incense and reform. Welcome to the Counter-Reformation, where the Church suddenly realizes it might have gone a little too far with the murder, mistress, and miracle marketing, and decides, perhaps, it's time to clean house, or at least look like it. The 16th century is burning. Protestantism has cracked Christendom wide open. Martin Luther's 95 Theses have gone viral by 16th century standards. Anyway, and suddenly, a whole lot of people are asking why the Pope owns so many hats and so few answers. Rome isn't just in trouble, it's on fire. Metaphorically, and sometimes literally, enter Pope Paul III. You spot him pacing through the Vatican gardens. Beard, like white lace. Hands clasped behind his back. He's no angel. To be clear, he had kids before becoming pope and made a few of them cardinals after. But unlike many of his predecessors, Paul III understands optics. He knows the Church has become a bloated, bureaucratic, occasionally blasphemous mess. So, he does something radical. He calls the Council of Trent. It's like a Vatican-wide emergency meeting, except it lasts 18 years, includes 25 sessions, and is spread across 3 popes. You sit in the back pew of a packed cathedral, while bishops argue over whether priests should actually know Latin before delivering Mass, and whether maybe the Church should stop, selling forgiveness, like souvenir keychains. There's yelling. There's paper shuffling. One cardinal faints from either holy fervor or a very tight collar, but slowly, painstakingly, the Church begins to reform. Out go the casual simony and the open mistress policies. In comes clerical education, standardized liturgy, and stricter rules on indulgences. A new Catholic identity emerges, one that values discipline, order, and not hosting chestnut banquets. You follow Paul III through the Vatican as he quietly commissions artists to create a new face for Catholicism literally. Michelangelo paints The Last Judgment on the Sistine Chapel wall, a terrifying mural of heaven and hell that screams, "Clean up your act, or else." It's big. It's angry. It's exactly the spiritual slap Rome needs. Historians still argue whether the reforms of Trent were genuinely heartfelt or a desperate PR stunt to hold on to power. Probably both. But they work. The bleeding slows. Catholicism doesn't collapse. It digs in, reinvents, doubles down. You meet the Jesuits, a new order founded by Ignatius of Loyola, dedicated to education, discipline, and unwavering loyalty to the Pope. These aren't your incense-waving monks. They're intellectuals, teachers, sometimes spies. They carry crosses in one hand and logic in the other. You watch them establish schools, mission outposts, and theological defenses that rival any Reformation pamphlet. The Pope, once seen as a corrupt landlord in a very fancy hat, is recast as a father figure, flawed but reforming, wounded but still powerful. Rome changes, but it doesn't forget. You pass by the bronze statue of St. Peter again, his foot worn smooth by centuries of kisses. You wonder how many of those pilgrims knew what went on behind the tapestries. How many chose to believe anyway? How many kissed that foot, hoping not for perfection, but for mercy? The Church, after all, is not just a monument, it's a mirror. And the papacy, for all its scandal, has always reflected the strange blend of holiness and humanity inside those robes. Some wore them well, some burned holes through them. But in the end, even after the corpse trials and pirate battles, the poison rings and forgery-prone relics, something sacred remained battered. Yes, but not broken. You step into St. Peter's Basilica one last time. The candles flicker. The air smells like centuries. Somewhere deep inside, a mass is being said in perfect Latin. A priest chants softly. A child yawns. A pigeon flutters high above the nave and then disappears. You exhale, because the story doesn't end here. It never does. And now, slowly, we drift away from the echoing halls and candlelit drama of medieval Rome. Let the streets fade behind you, the stone courtyards, the rustling vestments, the whispered plots behind marble columns. Let the incense lift into the ceiling of your mind, soft and curling, like smoke unraveling from a dream. The popes of the Middle Ages weren't simple men. Some were saints. Some were sinners. Most were something in between. And all of them, in their own flawed ways, shaped the world that came after brick by brick, relic by relic, scandal by scandal. You've walked with them now, felt the marble underfoot, the weight of those impossible hats, the velvet burden of spiritual power turned earthly ambition. You've seen the gold, the blood, the ink, the tears, the miracles and the missteps, but tonight, none of that asks anything more from you. Tonight, let it all fall away. You are not in the Vatican anymore. You are here, in stillness, in breath, in the quiet hush between midnight and morning. Let your thoughts slow. Let the questions go unanswered. There is no need, not right now, to solve anything. No doctrines to memorize, no relics to doubt. Just the soft darkness wrapping itself around you like a velvet robe. The bells do not ring tonight. Only silence. Only peace. You are safe. You are still. You are already halfway to sleep. And if a dream takes you back to Rome, let it be one with fewer popes and more pigeons. Good night. Sweet dreams.